The summer sun beat down on the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as hundreds of tourists gathered to witness the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Among the crowd stood the Morrison family, who had traveled all the way from California to experience London's royal traditions. Sarah Morrison clutched her camera, excited to capture every moment, while her husband Tom checked their itinerary on his phone. Between them stood their 12-year-old son Brandon, arms crossed and face twisted in boredom. Brandon had made it clear from the start that he didn't want to be there. While other children pressed against the palace gates with wonder in their eyes, he scrolled through his phone, occasionally looking up to complain about the heat, the crowd, or the fact that they were wasting time watching some guys in funny hats just standing there. His parents had tried everything to spark his interest, but Brandon had grown accustomed to getting his way. At home, tantrums and complaints usually resulted in his parents giving in, buying him something new, or changing their plans to suit his preferences. The Royal Guards stood motionless in their distinctive red tunics and bearskin hats, rifles at their sides. These were not actors or performers, but active soldiers of the British Army's Household Division, trained professionals who took their duty seriously. The tourists respected the tradition, keeping a respectful distance and following the posted rules about not touching the guards or interfering with their duties. But Brandon saw things differently. As the ceremony began, he noticed how still the guards remained, barely blinking despite the summer heat. To him, they looked like statues or robots, not real people. He turned to his mother and said loud enough for nearby tourists to hear that the guards were probably fake, just there for show. Sarah quietly shushed him, embarrassed by the stares from other visitors. Tom put a hand on his son's shoulder and whispered that these were real soldiers doing an important job. Brandon rolled his eyes and pulled away from his father's grip. He had been in a foul mood since they arrived in London 3 days ago. The hotel didn't have the right video games. The food was different from what he liked at home, and his parents kept dragging him to museums and historical sites when all he wanted was to stay in the room with his tablet. This palace visit was just another item on a list of things he didn't care about. As the minutes passed and the ceremony continued, Brandon's restlessness grew. He watched as other children stood quietly, some even saluting the guards respectfully. A little girl near him waved at one of the guards, her face full of innocent joy. The guard, of course, didn't respond, maintaining the stoic discipline required of his position. Brandon found this ridiculous. In his world, everyone responded when he demanded attention. The guard closest to the Morrison family was a young man in his mid-20s named James Patterson. He had served in the British Army for 6 years, including a tour in Afghanistan, where he had witnessed things that most people couldn't imagine. Standing guard at the palace was an honor, a duty he took seriously, despite the physical demands of remaining perfectly still in heavy uniform under the blazing sun. Behind his expressionless face, James was fully aware of everything happening around him, trained to notice any potential threats while maintaining his ceremonial posture. Brandon noticed a sign posted near the guard that warned visitors not to touch or interfere with the guards. The sign explained that the guards were on active duty and would take necessary action if anyone obstructed their work or posed a security risk. Most visitors read these signs and respected them. Brandon read it too, but it had the opposite effect. Something about being told what not to do triggered his contrary nature. He had spent his entire life pushing boundaries and testing limits. His parents had never enforced real consequences, always finding excuses for his behavior or blaming others when he got in trouble at school. Teachers had complained about his disrespect. Coaches had benched him for not following rules. Other parents had stopped inviting the Morrisons to gatherings because of Brandon's behavior. But none of this had changed anything. If anything, Brandon had learned that making a scene usually got him what he wanted. Sarah noticed her son staring at the guard with a strange expression. She recognized that look. It was the same face he made right before doing something he knew he shouldn't. She called his name quietly, trying to redirect his attention, but Brandon pretended not to hear. The crowd pressed closer as the ceremony reached a key moment, and in the shuffle, Brandon found himself just a few feet from Guard Patterson. Tom was taking photos and didn't notice as Brandon took several steps forward. moving past the invisible boundary that separated spectators from the guards. Other tourists shifted uncomfortably, sensing that something was about to happen. An elderly British woman nearby whispered to her husband that someone should stop that boy. But before anyone could intervene, Brandon reached out and tapped the guard's rifle. The crowd gasped. Guard Patterson remained perfectly still, but his eyes shifted slightly, acknowledging the breach. Brandon, emboldened by the reaction from the crowd and the guard's lack of response, smiled and did it again. This time, he didn't just tap, but grabbed the rifle barrel and tried to pull it. Sarah screamed her son's name and rushed forward, but it was too late. What Brandon didn't understand in his ignorance and arrogance was that he had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and the moment that would follow would change everything. The transformation was instant and terrifying. Guard Patterson's entire demeanor shifted from statue-like stillness to controlled military precision. In one fluid motion, he stepped back, securing his rifle firmly while his voice boomed across the courtyard with a force that made everyone within 50 feet freeze in place. The command was clear, sharp, and left no room for misunderstanding. He ordered Brandon to step back immediately, his tone carrying the weight of authority earned through years of military training and discipline. Brandon stumbled backward, his face going pale. For the first time in his life, he had encountered someone who wouldn't bend to his will. Someone who represented real authority with real consequences. The smirk vanished from his face, replaced by genuine fear. The crowd had gone completely silent, hundreds of eyes now fixed on the scene unfolding before them. Sarah finally reached her son, grabbing his arm and pulling him away while stammering apologies. Tom rushed over, his face red with embarrassment and anger. Though whether the anger was directed at his son or the situation remained unclear, but the incident wasn't over. 2 palace security officers appeared within seconds, moving swiftly through the crowd. They were polite but firm, asking the Morrison family to step aside for a conversation. Brandon's hands were shaking now, the reality of what he had done beginning to sink in. Other tourists whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads in disapproval, others holding up their phones. Having captured the entire encounter on video, the security officers explained the seriousness of what had just occurred. Interfering with a Royal Guard on duty was not a minor offense. These guards were authorized to use force if necessary to protect themselves, the palace, and the royal family. Brandon had touched military equipment and physically tried to move it from a soldier's possession. The officers made it clear that they could involve the police, that there could be legal consequences. Especially given that everything had been captured on security cameras and dozens of tourist videos, Sarah began to cry, apologizing profusely, explaining that her son didn't understand, that they were just tourists who didn't know better. But even as she spoke, she knew it wasn't true. The signs were everywhere. The warnings were clear. And deep down, she knew this wasn't about not understanding rules. This was about a child who had never been taught to respect boundaries, and parents who had never enforced them. Tom tried a different approach. His voice, taking on the defensive tone he always used when Brandon got in trouble. He suggested the guards were overreacting, that Brandon was just a kid being curious, that surely this could all be overlooked. The security officers remained professional, but unmoved. One of them pointed out that other children had managed to observe the ceremony without touching the guards or their equipment. The issue wasn't curiosity, but deliberate disrespect for clearly posted rules. Brandon stood between his parents, shrinking under the weight of genuine consequences for the first time. He wanted to disappear, to wake up and find this was all a bad dream. The tourists continued to stare, and he could feel their judgment. Some looked angry, others disappointed. A few seemed to feel sorry for him. But most just looked at him with the kind of disgust reserved for people who showed disrespect in sacred or important places. Guard Patterson had returned to his post, resuming his ceremonial stance as if nothing had happened. But Brandon couldn't stop looking at him. Couldn't forget the moment when that commanding voice had shattered his sense of invincibility. The guard wasn't angry or vindictive. He had simply done his job, enforcing boundaries that existed for important reasons. Brandon had expected yelling or punishment that would make him the victim, something he could use to gain sympathy. Instead, he got cold. Professional discipline that left no room for excuses. The security officers continued their discussion with the Morrison family, away from the main crowd. They explained that while they could press charges, they were willing to consider the situation more carefully given that Brandon was a minor and a tourist. However, they needed assurances that the family understood the gravity of what had happened. They asked Brandon directly if he understood what he had done wrong and why it was serious. Brandon nodded. But his response was quiet and sullen, still not fully processing the situation. One of the officers knelt down to his eye level and spoke more gently, but no less firmly. He explained that the guards were real soldiers who had served their country, some in war zones, some risking their lives. The ceremony wasn't entertainment. It was a tradition of honor and duty. By treating it like a joke, Brandon had disrespected not just one guard but an entire military heritage. Something in the officer's words cut through Brandon's defensiveness. Maybe it was the man's calm tone, or the fact that he wasn't yelling or making excuses. For the first time, Brandon felt something other than embarrassment or fear. He felt shame. Real deep shame at what he had done. The tourists watching weren't just angry strangers anymore. They were people who had come to witness something meaningful, and he had disrupted it. The guard wasn't a robot or a toy. He was a person doing an important job that Brandon had treated like a game. Sarah noticed the change in her son's expression and felt her own shame multiply. How had they let it get to this point? How many warning signs had they ignored? How many teachers, coaches, and other parents had tried to tell them that Brandon's behavior was becoming a serious problem? In that moment, standing in front of Buckingham Palace with security officers deciding whether to involve the police, Sarah finally admitted to herself what she had been avoiding for years. They had failed their son by never teaching him respect, boundaries, or consequences. The officers exchanged glances and seemed to reach an unspoken agreement. They told the Morrisons they would not be involving the police this time. But the incident would be documented, and the family would need to leave the palace grounds immediately. They were also barred from returning for the remainder of their stay in London. Tom started to protest, but Sarah stopped him with a hand on his arm. She thanked the officers quietly and turned to lead her family away from the crowd as they walked toward the exit. Brandon glanced back one more time at Guard Patterson, still standing at perfect attention. The guard's eyes didn't follow him, didn't acknowledge him at all. Somehow, that was worse than anger would have been. Brandon had become invisible again, but not in the way he was used to. He wasn't being ignored because people gave in to him. He was being dismissed because he didn't matter, because his actions had consequences that removed his privilege to be present. The weight of that realization settled on his shoulders like a heavy stone. And for the first time in years, Brandon Morrison felt truly small. The walk back to their hotel was the longest 20 minutes of the Morrison family's life. Nobody spoke. Tom kept his eyes straight ahead, his jaw clenched tight. Sarah wiped tears from her face, trying to process what had just happened. Brandon walked between them, his earlier arrogance completely gone, placed by a hollow feeling in his chest that he couldn't quite name. The London streets that had seemed so exciting just days ago now felt cold, and you'd see on sea of other tourists pass them, laughing and taking photos, completely unaware of the scene that had just unfolded at the palace. Brandon wondered how many of those people had witnessed his humiliation, how many had recorded it on their phones. In the age of social media, his mistake could be everywhere by tonight. The thought made his stomach turn. He imagined kids from his school seeing the video, teachers watching it, everyone knowing what he had done. When they reached the hotel room, Tom finally spoke. His voice was low and controlled, which was somehow more frightening than yelling would have been. He told Brandon to sit down because they needed to have a serious conversation. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap, looking more defeated than angry. Brandon had seen his parents upset before, had seen them frustrated with his behavior countless times, but this was different. This was something deeper. Tom began by asking Brandon if he understood what could have happened. The guard could have perceived him as a threat and responded with force. The security officers could have called the police. They could have been detained, questioned for hours. Their entire trip could have been ruined. And Brandon could have ended up with a record that would follow him for the rest of his life. At 12 years old, he had come dangerously close to creating consequences that couldn't be undone. But then, Tom said something that surprised Brandon. He said that what happened today wasn't just Brandon's fault. Tom looked at Sarah, and she nodded, her eyes filling with tears again. Tom explained that they had failed as parents. They had made excuses for Brandon's behavior for years, blamed teachers when he got in trouble at school, replaced things he broke without making him face consequences. They had taught him that rules didn't apply to him, that making a scene would get him what he wanted, that other people's feelings and boundaries didn't matter. Sarah spoke up, her voice shaking. She talked about how they had both grown up with strict parents, how they had promised themselves they would be different, more understanding, more flexible. But somewhere along the way, they had confused being understanding with having no boundaries at all. They had given Brandon everything except what he actually needed, which was structure, discipline. And the understanding that his actions affected other people, Brandon listened, unsure how to respond. Part of him wanted to argue, to defend himself, to point out that they were the ones who gave in to him, so how was it his fault? But another part of him, the part that was still thinking about Guard Patterson's emotionless face and the security officer's words. He had become someone he didn't particularly like, and today had proven it in the most public, humiliating way possible. Tom continued, explaining that things were going to change starting immediately. There would be real consequences for his actions from now on. The expensive phone Brandon was holding would be taken away except for emergencies. When they got home, he would be writing apology letters to every teacher who had complained about his behavior. He would be apologizing to the neighbors whose property he had damaged. He would be doing chores to earn back privileges instead of having everything handed to him. But more importantly, Tom said they were going to help Brandon understand why respect mattered, why rules existed, why other people's feelings and boundaries were important. This wasn't about punishment for the sake of punishment. This was about teaching him to be a better person before it was too late. Before he became an adult who thought the world revolved around him and ended up alone and unhappy. Brandon. Maybe it was the weight of the day, or maybe it was finally hearing his parents speak to him with complete honesty instead of making excuses. His eyes began to water, and before he could stop himself, he was crying. Not the manipulative crying he had used before to get his way, but real tears of shame, regret, and fear about who he was becoming. Sarah moved next to him and put her arm around his shoulders. She didn't tell him it was okay because it wasn't. She didn't tell him not to cry because he needed to. She just sat with him, letting him feel the full weight of what had happened. After a few minutes, Brandon managed to speak. His voice was small and broken as he said he was sorry. He was sorry for what he did at the palace. Sorry for all the times he had embarrassed them. Sorry for being such a difficult kid. Tom knelt in front of his son and looked him in the eyes. He said that being sorry was a start, but sorry wasn't enough by itself. Brandon would need to prove through his actions that he meant it. And it wouldn't be easy. Changing behavior that had been reinforced for years would take time, effort, and genuine commitment. There would be days when Brandon would want to fall back into old patterns, when it would be easier to throw a tantrum than to handle disappointment maturely. But they would work through it together as a family. The rest of the evening passed quietly. They ordered room service instead of going out to dinner, nobody feeling up to facing the public. Brandon sat by the window, watching the London skyline as the sun set, thinking about everything that had happened. He thought about Guard Patterson, still standing at his post long after Brandon had been escorted away. He thought about the little girl who had waved at the guard with innocent respect, something Brandon couldn't remember feeling about anything in years. That night, lying in the hotel bed, unable to sleep, Brandon made a decision. He asked his parents if there was any way to send an apology to the guard. Not because he thought it would fix anything or make him feel better, but because the man deserved to know that at least one person understood they had been wrong. Sarah said she would find out in the morning if there was an appropriate way to do that. As Brandon finally drifted off to sleep, he didn't feel the anger or resentment he usually felt when things didn't go his way. Instead, he felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. It was uncomfortable and painful, but also strangely clarifying. He felt the beginning of genuine remorse, and with it, the first small seed of understanding that maybe, just maybe, he could become someone better than who he had been today. The journey wouldn't be easy and tomorrow would bring its own challenges. But for the first time, Brandon Morrison was ready to try. Morning came with gray London skies and a heaviness that matched Brandon's mood. True to her word, Sarah had spent the early hours researching how to properly send an apology to the Palace Guard. She discovered that written letters could be submitted through official channels, though she warned Brandon not to expect a response. The guards received countless letters, and it wasn't their job to respond to tourists. The apology would be for Brandon's own conscience, not for recognition or forgiveness. Brandon sat at the small hotel desk with a blank piece of paper in front of him. He had written plenty of forced apologies before, quick notes that his teachers required after he misbehaved, words that meant nothing because he was just trying to get out of trouble. But this felt different. Every time he tried to write something, it sounded hollow and fake. How could he possibly put into words the realization he had come to? How could he explain that he was sorry not just for touching the rifle, but for the person he had become? After several crumpled attempts, Brandon finally wrote from his heart. He explained that he had been disrespectful and wrong, that he had treated a serious duty like entertainment, and that he understood now that the guard was a real person deserving of respect, not a toy for tourists. He admitted that he had spent most of his life not thinking about how his actions affected others, and that yesterday had been a painful but necessary wake-up call. He ended by saying he hoped to become the kind of person who would honor traditions and respect boundaries. Even when no one was watching, Sarah read the letter, tears welling up again as she recognized the genuine emotion in her son's words. Tom nodded approvingly, noting that it was honest, and took responsibility without making excuses. They helped Brandon put it in an envelope, addressed it properly, and promised to deliver it to the appropriate palace office before they left. London in 2 days. The family spent the next day very differently than they had planned their vacation. Instead of tourist attractions and souvenir shops, they took a long walk through London's quieter neighborhoods. They talked about respect, consequences, and what it meant to be a good person. Tom shared stories from his own childhood, admitting times he had been disrespectful and the hard lessons he had learned. Sarah opened up about struggles she had faced in learning to set boundaries in her own life. Brandon listened in a way he never had before. Without his phone to distract him, without the option to tune out or complain until they gave in, he actually heard what his parents were saying. He began to understand that they weren't perfect either, that they were trying to figure things out just like he was. The conversation wasn't about blame anymore. It was about moving forward together. That afternoon, something unexpected happened. As they walked through a park, they encountered a street performer entertaining a crowd with magic tricks. Brandon watched as children laughed and clapped, completely engaged in the moment. The performer made mistakes occasionally, tricks that didn't quite work, but the audience remained supportive and kind. Brandon noticed how the performer thanked everyone, how he treated even the youngest children with respect and patience. When the show ended, people dropped coins and bills into the performer's hat. Brandon watched his father add some money and felt moved to do something he had never done before. He asked his parents if he could use some of his own saved money to contribute. Sarah looked surprised, but handed him a few pounds. Brandon walked up to the hat, dropped the money in, and when the performer thanked him, Brandon said something he meant. He told the performer he appreciated the show and the way he treated people with kindness. It was a small moment. It's barely noticeable to anyone else, but it felt monumental to Brandon. He had given something without expecting anything in return. He had expressed genuine appreciation to a stranger. He had participated in the world around him instead of just demanding it entertain him. The performer smiled warmly and shook his hand. And Brandon felt a strange warmth in his chest that he couldn't quite identify at first. Later, he realized it was the feeling of connection, being part of something larger than himself. That evening, Sarah made a phone call that would change everything. Through a friend who had military connections, she managed to reach someone who knew Guard Patterson personally. She explained the situation, including Brandon's genuine remorse and his letter of apology. She didn't ask for anything, simply wanted to make sure the letter reached the right person and that the guard knew how seriously they were taking the incident. What happened next? No one could have predicted. The contact explained that Guard Patterson's story was far more complex than any tourist could have guessed. He agreed to share something that wasn't widely known, hoping it might help Brandon understand the deeper significance of what had happened. Guard Patterson had indeed served in Afghanistan. But what the Morrison family didn't know was that he had lost his best friend and fellow soldier during that deployment. His friend, David Chen, had been killed by an insurgent who had posed as a harmless civilian before attacking. David had hesitated to use force because the person seemed unthreatening, appeared to be unarmed. That moment of hesitation, that split-second decision to give someone the benefit of the doubt, had cost him his life. Patterson had been there, had watched his friend die, had carried the guilt and grief of that moment every single day since. The reason Patterson took his guard duty so seriously, the reason he couldn't allow any interference, no matter how harmless it seemed, was because he had learned the hardest way possible that threats could come from anyone at any time. His stillness, his discipline, his immediate response to Brandon's actions weren't about being mean or scary. They were about staying alive and protecting others. Lessons written in the blood of someone he loved. The contact explained that Patterson didn't share this story often, but he wanted the Morrison family to understand something important. He didn't hate Brandon. He didn't even hold a grudge. He simply hoped that, perhaps this incident might teach a valuable lesson about respect, about understanding that rules and boundaries exist for reasons we might not always see or understand. Every guard standing at that palace carried their own story, their own reasons for taking their duty seriously. Sarah listened to all of this with tears streaming down her face. When she hung up the phone and shared the story with Tom and Brandon, the room fell silent. Brandon felt like he had been punched in the stomach. He had thought the guard was just doing a job, following rules for the sake of rules. He had never imagined the pain, the sacrifice, the loss that stood behind that red uniform and bearskin hat. Tom put his hand on his son's shoulder as Brandon began to cry again. This time the tears came from a deeper place, from genuine understanding of how shallow and selfish his worldview had been. He hadn't just disrespected a guard. He had disrespected the memory of a fallen soldier, the sacrifice of people who protected others at great personal cost. His actions meant to get attention and break rules for entertainment had occurred in the presence of someone carrying grief that Brandon couldn't begin to imagine. Brandon asked if there was any way to meet Guard Patterson, to apologize in person, to somehow make this right. Sarah gently explained that might not be possible or appropriate. The guard had his own healing to do, his own life to live. The best thing Brandon could do was learn from this experience, carry it forward, and become someone who honored what people like Patterson and Chen represented through his own actions and choices. That night, Brandon rewrote his letter. The new version was longer, more thoughtful, and infinitely more humble. He didn't just apologize for what he had done. He thanked Guard Patterson for the lesson, for the service, for the sacrifice that Brandon now understood, even if only partially. He promised to remember this moment, to use it to become better, to honor the memory of Sergeant David Chen by treating others with the respect and dignity they deserved. As the Morrison family prepared for their last day in London, they weren't just tourists anymore, moving thoughtlessly through experiences. They were people who had been changed by an encounter they would never forget, carrying a story that would shape their family for years to come. The question now was whether the change would last, whether the lessons learned in pain and shame would translate into lasting transformation. Tomorrow would begin to answer that question. The Morrison family's final day in London dawned with unexpected purpose. Sarah had been contacted by the military liaison with surprising news. Guard Patterson had received Brandon's letter through the proper channels and had done something unprecedented. He wanted to meet the family, not as a guard on duty, but as a person. The meeting would be brief and private, taking place at a memorial garden dedicated to fallen soldiers near the palace grounds. Brandon could barely eat breakfast. His stomach was in knots, and his hands wouldn't stop shaking. Part of him wanted to run, to avoid facing the man he had wronged. But a stronger part, a newer part that was just beginning to emerge, knew this was something he needed to do. Tom and Sarah were equally nervous, unsure what to expect but grateful for the opportunity. They arrived at the memorial garden 15 minutes early. It was a quiet, beautiful space filled with roses and oak trees, with stone benches arranged around a central monument listing names of soldiers who had given their lives in service. Brandon found himself reading the names, each one representing a person with a story, a family, a life cut short. About halfway down one column, he saw it, Sergeant David Chen, with a date that showed he had been only 26 years old when he died. When Guard Patterson arrived, he was in civilian clothes, jeans, and a simple shirt, looking younger and more approachable than he had in his ceremonial uniform. But his eyes still carried that same intensity, that awareness of everything around him. Sarah and Tom stood up immediately, but Patterson raised a hand in a gentle gesture, asking them to relax. He looked at Brandon, and for a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Patterson sat down on one of the benches and invited Brandon to sit next to him. The parents stayed back slightly, giving them space. Patterson's voice was soft, completely different from the commanding boom Brandon had heard at the palace. He thanked Brandon for the letter and said that not many people had the courage to write something so honest. He acknowledged that what Brandon had done was wrong, but he also recognized the genuine remorse in the boy's words. Brandon managed to speak, voice barely above a whisper. He apologized again, but this time he could look Patterson in the eye as he did it. He said he had learned about Sergeant Chen, about what Patterson had experienced, that he understood now why the rules mattered so much. He admitted that he had spent most of his life thinking only about himself, that he wanted to change, but didn't quite know how. Patterson nodded slowly, then did something that shocked everyone. He smiled. Not a big smile, but a genuine one that softened his entire face. He told Brandon that recognizing you need to change is the hardest part. The rest is just work, day by day, choice by choice. He explained that he hadn't always been disciplined either. The military had taught him structure and respect, but more than that. Losing David had taught him that every moment matters, every person matters, and that our actions ripple out in ways we can't always predict. He told Brandon about David. Not the sanitized version of a fallen hero, but the real person. David, who loved terrible puns and made everyone laugh even in the worst situations. David, who wrote letters to his little sister every week no matter how dangerous things got. David, who had believed in giving people second chances and seeing the good in others even when it cost him everything. Patterson's voice caught slightly when he said that David would have liked Brandon's letter, would have believed in the possibility of someone learning and growing from their mistakes. Patterson then asked Brandon a question that would stay with him forever. He asked what Brandon wanted to become, not what he wanted to be when he grew up. What kind of person he wanted to become right now, today. Brandon thought for a long moment before answering. He said he wanted to become someone who thought about others, respected boundaries and traditions, who made his parents proud instead of embarrassed. Someone who, if he ever had the chance, would stand up for what was right, even when it was hard. Patterson reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. It was a challenge coin, a military tradition where coins are given to mark significant moments or to honor someone. This particular coin had the insignia of Patterson's regiment on one side. On the other side was engraved a simple phrase, "Honor through action." Patterson explained that David had given him this coin years ago, during their first deployment together. He had carried it every day since David died, a reminder of his friend and the values they both believed in. He pressed the coin into Brandon's hand and told him he wanted Brandon to have it. Not as a reward, but as a responsibility. Every time Brandon looked at that coin, he should remember this moment, this lesson, and the choice he had to make every single day about what kind of person to be. He made Brandon promise that if he ever felt himself slipping back into old patterns, he would hold that coin and remember that actions matter, that respect isn't just a word, and that being a good person is something you practice, not something you simply are. Brandon's hands closed around the coin, and tears rolled down his face. He promised he would honor it, would carry it, and remember. Sarah and Tom had tears in their own eyes, witnessing this extraordinary act of grace from a man who had every right to be angry, who had suffered loss they could barely comprehend, yet chose to extend kindness and wisdom to a child who had disrespected him. Patterson stood up, and Brandon stood with him. Then, in a gesture that surprised everyone, including Brandon himself, the boy stood at attention and gave a salute. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't practiced, but it came from a place of genuine respect and gratitude. Patterson returned the salute with military precision, acknowledging the gesture and the growth it represented. Then he did something even more unexpected. He extended his hand for a handshake, treating Brandon not as a child who had misbehaved, but as a young man taking his first steps toward becoming someone better. As Patterson prepared to leave, he turned to Sarah and Tom. He told them that their willingness to acknowledge their own mistakes and commit to change was just as important as Brandon's growth. Parenting was the hardest job in the world, and admitting when you've gotten it wrong takes real courage. He encouraged them to be patient with the process, to remember that change doesn't happen overnight, but that every small choice in the right direction matters. After Patterson left, the Morrison family sat together in the memorial garden for a long time. They didn't talk much, just sat with the weight of what had happened, the grace they had been shown, and the responsibility they now carried. Brandon held the challenge coin tightly, feeling its weight in his palm, understanding that it represented far more than metal and words. It represented trust, hope, and the possibility of redemption. On the flight home the next day, Brandon kept the coin in his pocket, touching it periodically, as if to make sure it was real. His parents noticed he didn't ask for his phone back, didn't complain about the long flight, didn't demand anything. He was quiet, thoughtful, clearly processing everything that had happened. When the plane landed and they drove home, Brandon looked at his familiar neighborhood with different eyes, seeing all the places where he had acted poorly, all the people he had disrespected or taken for granted. The change didn't happen all at once, and it wasn't always easy. There were moments in the following weeks and months when Brandon wanted to fall back into old patterns, when being considerate and respectful felt harder than being selfish, but each time he would touch the coin in his pocket and remember Patterson's face, David Chin's name on that memorial, and the promise he had made. Slowly, day by day, choice by choice, Brandon became someone different. His teachers noticed. His neighbors noticed. Other parents noticed, but most importantly, Brandon noticed. He felt lighter somehow, happier, in a way he had never been when he was demanding everyone's attention and getting his way. Relationships that had been damaged began to heal. New friendships formed with kids who had previously avoided him. His parents learned alongside him, setting boundaries with love, enforcing consequences with compassion, and modeling the behavior they wanted to see. A year later, Brandon wrote another letter to Guard Patterson. He told him about the changes he had made, the challenges he had faced, and the person he was becoming. He explained that he carried the challenge coin everywhere, and that it had become a symbol not just of what he had done wrong, but of what he could become through dedication and effort. He thanked Patterson again for the grace shown to him, for seeing potential in a moment when Brandon had shown his worst self. Patterson wrote back a brief note congratulating Brandon on his growth and reminding him that the journey never really ends. Every day offers new chances to choose honor through action, to be someone who makes the world a little better through respect, kindness, and awareness of how our choices affect others. He ended the letter by saying that somewhere he believed David Chen was smiling, that David had always believed in the power of second chances and the capacity of people to grow beyond their mistakes. The Morrison family kept that letter, along with Brandon's original apology and Patterson's response, in a frame in their home. It served as a reminder of the summer day in London when everything changed, when an entitled kid's challenge to a Royal Guard led not to the disaster it could have been, but to a transformation that rippled through an entire family. The story became one they shared carefully, not to embarrass Brandon, but to illustrate the power of taking responsibility, the grace of forgiveness, and the possibility of becoming better than who we were yesterday. Brandon eventually graduated high school with honors, went to college, and chose a career in teaching, inspired by the way one person's patience and wisdom had changed his life. He still carries that challenge coin, now worn smooth from years, in his pocket. And when he encounters students who remind him of his younger self, kids struggling with entitlement or disrespect, he knows exactly what to say. He tells them his story, shows them the coin. It reminds them that who you are today doesn't have to be who you are tomorrow. Change is possible, but it starts with one moment of genuine recognition. One honest apology, and one choice to honor through action the lessons life teaches us. Even when those lessons come in the most unexpected and humbling ways.